Entire libraries exist that have never reached your hands. Cuneiform tablets kept in museums, apocryphal manuscripts archived in Ethiopian monasteries, Sumerian records translated only by specialists who prefer academic silence to public dissemination. And within these texts, a pattern repeats itself with disturbing precision. The description of beings who came, intervened, departed, and left specific promises of return. We are not talking about vague mythology or modern spiritual interpretations. We are talking about dated records, preserved for millennia, that describe cycles of presence and absence with operational detail. The best-known name for these beings in Mesopotamian sources is Anunnaki, but this term does not appear alone. It is connected to a network of texts that crosses seemingly unconnected cultures, languages, and religious traditions. And what these texts reveal is not just what happened. It is what is programmed to happen again. What you are about to learn is not conspiracy theory. It is a direct reading of primary sources that are rarely presented in a connected way. And the most disconcerting revelation isn't at the beginning of this story. It's at the end, when the patterns come together and it becomes impossible to ignore that something much bigger than politics or religion is operating behind the scenes of human history. Before continuing, please like this video. This helps the algorithm deliver this type of content to more people who are looking for real information, not superficial repetition. The word Anunnaki first appears in Sumerian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE. Literally, the term means those who came from heaven to earth. It is not a poetic metaphor, it is a functional description recorded in writing systems that were developed for administration, not religious literature. In the tablets catalogued as Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, and in the administrative records of Nippur, Uruk, and Eridu, the Anunnaki are presented as a specific category of entities that exercised functions of government, territorial engineering, and direct population control. They were not worshipped as abstract and distant gods. They were recognized as present, physical authorities. The difference is fundamental to understanding what these texts really say. When an ancient human described a transcendent god, they used language of reverence, mystery, and conceptual distance. When describing the Anunnaki, they used language of administrative hierarchy, specific function, and operational presence. The texts speak of assemblies where decisions were made collectively, of territorial divisions among different members of the Anunnaki hierarchy, of internal conflicts over power and resources, and of direct interventions in the organization of human society. This is not mythical language of abstract cosmological creation. It is administrative language of concrete territorial management. The records were preserved in clay because fired clay survives the test of time in an unparalleled way. Unlike Egyptian papyrus, which deteriorates with humidity, or parchment, which rots or burns easily, cuneiform tablets resist fires, floods, earthquakes, and even deliberate looting. Therefore, today we have more than 500,000 tablets catalogued in museums and institutions around the world, of which only a fraction have been adequately translated, and an even smaller portion have been disseminated outside the restricted academic circle. Most are in the storage of the British Museum, the Louvre, the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, the University of Pennsylvania, and Iraqi institutions that survived recent conflicts. Many tablets were looted during the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and sold on the international black market for antiquities. Thousands more remain buried in archaeological sites that have not yet been excavated due to lack of resources or political instability in the region. What does this mean in practice? This means that the complete narrative about the Anunnaki, their origin, their specific functions, their internal conflicts, and especially their plans for return, is not yet fully available for public analysis. What we currently have is sufficient to establish the basic operational pattern and to connect it with other textual traditions. But it is not enough to close the investigation or to declare that we already know everything about the subject. Now consider something that is rarely mentioned when discussing ancient texts. The Sumerian records are not the only ones to speak of entities that descended from the heavens, intervened in human history, and then withdrew with promises of future return. The Book of Enoch, preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and considered canonical scripture by the Ethiopian Church to this day, describes the Watchers in impressive detail. Beings who physically descended on Mount Hermon made a pact among themselves to intervene in humanity, taught forbidden knowledge to humans, generated hybrid offspring through union with human women, and were severely punished for violating the established rules of permitted intervention. The text of Enoch is neither vague nor allegorical. It lists 200 names of watchers, describes specific functions that each taught, details the genetic and social consequences of hybridization, and records the judgment pronounced against them. Azazel, one of the leaders, taught men the making of swords, knives, shields, breastplates, and all the arts of war. Shemyaza, the main leader, organized the descent and the pact of collective intervention. Amaros taught the breaking of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the signs of the constellations. Tamiel taught astronomy. Azradel taught the courses of the moon. Each had a specialty, each transmitted specific knowledge, and the result was a humanity radically altered in technological capabilities, astronomical knowledge, and military power. According to the Book of Enoch, the answer was the flood, but not as an abstract moral punishment for generic sins. It was an operational reset to eliminate genetic contamination and restore the human lineage to its original pattern. This completely changes the interpretation of the flood. It's not God having a fit of rage. It's an emergency protocol being activated when established parameters are violated beyond the point of no return. Now connect this directly to Mesopotamian texts that speak of the same event. The flood narrative appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically on Tablet 11, in the even older Epic of Atrahasis, and in later Assyrian fragments. In absolutely all these records, the flood is not the decision of a single god acting alone. It is the decision of a council of entities deliberating collectively. And in all of them, a specific human is warned beforehand by one of the council entities who disagrees with the decision or who decides to preserve the human species despite the majority decision. In the earliest Sumerian case, Enki warns Ziusudra and gives him detailed instructions for shipbuilding. In the later Babylonian case, Ea warns Utnapishtim. In the biblical case, a divine messenger or God himself warns Noah. The structural pattern is absolutely identical. Unauthorized intervention, genetic alteration of humanity, deliberation by a higher council, decision to reset, preservation of a specific lineage through internal warning, post-diluvian reconstruction under new rules. But there is a critical detail in these texts that is almost never explained when people talk about the Anunnaki or the flood. And this detail fundamentally changes what these events mean. According to Sumerian and Akkadian records, the Anunnaki did not come from an abstract spiritual plane or an incomprehensible metaphysical dimension. They came from a physical place that the texts describe with consistent terminology. The term used in some later texts is Nibiru, but in older texts it is simply upper heaven, a place beyond the visible stars or a distant region of the heavens. What matters for our analysis is not identifying this place astronomically with modern precision. It is understanding the functional description that the texts present. They came from somewhere. That place was not Earth. The journey was physical, not spiritual. They established operational bases in specific locations in Mesopotamia. They created a workforce initially using their own subordinates, then created or modified humans through a process that the texts describe as a mixture of essences, a union of divine material with earthly material, or the molding of clay combined with divine blood. The descriptions vary textually, but the concept is consistent: genetic engineering to create a hybrid species capable of heavy physical labor and understanding complex orders. And then, according to Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki did not disappear completely from Earth. They partially withdrew to their celestial cities while maintaining a reduced presence through human intermediaries. The difference between disappearing and withdrawing is operational and crucial. Disappearing implies ceasing existence or ceasing any form of interaction. Withdrawing implies a change in position or intensity of presence while maintaining existence and the capacity to return. And here begins the part that connects absolutely everything we are discussing, because the Mesopotamian texts don't just say that the Anunnaki withdrew from direct presence. They explicitly say that they will return. In the Enuma Elish, after Marduk established the current cosmic order and reorganized the divine hierarchy, there are recorded promises of the return of the great gods when the established time cycles are completed. In the Atrahasis, after the flood and the reorganization of surviving humanity, the intervention of the Anunnaki does not cease completely. It only changes in intensity and method, with promises of full return at the appropriate time. In the Book of Enoch, the fallen watchers are imprisoned in valleys of darkness and abysses of fire, but they are not annihilated. They are kept imprisoned specifically until the day of the great judgment, when they will be released, return to the surface of the earth, and participate in the final confrontation between the loyalist and rebel forces. In the Book of Jubilees, also preserved completely only in Ethiopian tradition, there are extremely detailed descriptions of time cycles, jubilees of years, which are periods of 49 years, and specific temporal markers indicating when certain prophetic events must necessarily occur. This is not mystical prophecy based on subjective visions. It is an operational timetable based on established cycles. Now look carefully at the apocalyptic texts of the biblical tradition. The Book of Daniel, written during the Babylonian exile, and therefore in direct contact with Mesopotamian traditions, speaks of 70 weeks of years, a specific prophetic period marking phases of human history leading up to a final intervention. The Apocalypse of John, written at the end of the 1st century, speaks of seals being opened sequentially, trumpets being sounded in a specific order, bowls being poured out in a determined sequence, each marking precise stages of a historical completion process. These are not random mystical events that happen when God decides arbitrarily. They are phases of a pre-established protocol being executed according to schedule. And this protocol has a central element that is almost never clearly explained in popular religious circles: the return of previous authorities who were temporarily removed. In Revelation, when the 7 seals of the book are opened one by one, what is being revealed is not new information that God is creating at that moment. It is ancient information that was sealed, awaiting the appropriate time for revelation. When the 7 trumpets sound progressively, what is being summoned is not the creation of new armies. It is the return of forces that already existed but were in other positions. When the 7 bowls are poured out upon the earth, what is being activated is not judgment invented at the moment. It is the execution of terms that were previously established in ancient cosmic contracts. This completely changes how we should read the apocalyptic text, because if the final event is not a completely new and unprecedented divine intervention, but rather the return of a divine intervention that already existed previously and was temporarily suspended, then absolutely everything that happened in the intervening history was not a definitive conclusion to anything. It was a temporary suspension awaiting programmed reactivation. go back to the Anunnaki with this perspective. In the Sumerian and Akkadian texts, after the global flood that reconfigured the Earth's surface and eliminated most of the problematic hybrid population, the presence of the Anunnaki radically changes in nature. They no longer live directly among humans in shared cities. They no longer walk visibly through the streets, giving orders face to face. Instead, they establish a system of carefully selected human intermediaries. Kings who receive authority and legitimacy directly from heaven through investiture rituals. Priests who maintain communication with the Anunnaki through specific rituals, prescribed offerings, and oracular consultations in temples built according to revealed architectural plans. This structure is functionally identical to the structure that appears in the post-flood biblical narrative. Noah leaves the ark after the waters recede, offers sacrifice following specific instructions, receives a divine promise of non-repetition of the flood reset method, and the surviving humanity is reorganized under a new tribal and geographical hierarchy with updated rules. But the promise God makes to Noah is not one of a definitive absence of divine presence. It is specifically about the non-repetition of that particular method of global reset through water. The next reset, according to later prophetic texts, will be fundamentally different. It will not be through water covering the earth. It will be through purifying fire, through revelation that exposes everything that was hidden, through direct confrontation between rival authorities that can no longer coexist. And here is the connection that inescapably closes the pattern. Because in Mesopotamian texts, the full return of the Anunnaki is consistently linked to an event that different texts call the Great Assembly of the End Times, when all the Anunnaki will return simultaneously, when ancient disputes will finally be resolved, when pending judgments will be executed, and when permanent order will be established without the possibility of future rebellion. And in the biblical apocalypse, the return of Christ is directly linked to an event called the Judgment of the Nations before the Great White Throne, when all the dead will be resurrected, when all works will be evaluated, when a definitive separation will occur between the saved and the condemned, and when a new permanent order will be established with new heavens and a new earth. The descriptions are not textually identical word for word, but they are structurally and functionally parallel in such a way that it cannot be coincidence or superficial copying. Both sets of texts speak of the return of authority that was previously present, judgment based on actions performed during the period of absence or reduced presence of that authority, definitive separation between those who aligned themselves with legitimate authority and those who rebelled or allied themselves with illegitimate authorities, and the establishment of a new order that will not be temporary but permanent and irreversible. The primary difference lies in the specific identity of the supreme authority that returns. For the Mesopotamian texts, it is Marduk or Anu, or another high-ranking member of the Anunnaki hierarchy. For the biblical texts, it is Christ as Messiah and Son of the Most High God. But the operational protocol is structurally the same, and this raises a question that cannot be avoided. If texts from geographically separate, linguistically distinct, and temporally distanced cultures, by centuries or even millennia, all describe the same basic operational pattern of intervention, withdrawal, and programmed return, then only two explanations are logically possible. First explanation, all these texts copied from each other without really understanding what they were copying, simply reproducing a narrative they found interesting from a literary standpoint. Second explanation, all these texts are recording culturally adapted versions of real historical events that occurred globally and left a collective memory preserved in multiple independent traditions. The first explanation faces serious problems. Because the texts are not simple copies, the specific details vary greatly, the names of the entities are different, the underlying theology is different, but the operational structure is too consistent. This is not a pattern of superficial literary copying. It is a pattern of independent reporting of related events. The second explanation is much more disturbing to the modern worldview, because it implies that the history of humanity is not a sequence of independent civilizations that arose in isolation, developed technology progressively, and advanced linearly to modernity. It implies that human history is actually a sequence of cycles under the external supervision of non-human entities that intervened directly at specific moments, withdrew after cataclysmic events, and promised to return when specific conditions were met. This implies that the current cycle we are living through is neither the last nor the most advanced. It is merely the most recent in a series that may be much longer than we imagine. If you've been following along this far and realize this isn't just superficial internet chatter, subscribe to the channel. This type of content isn't common. Most channels on these topics repeat superficial interpretations taken from popular books or sensationalist documentaries. Here, we work directly with primary sources, translate academic texts, and present connections that are rarely discussed in an accessible yet rigorous way. Now let's move to the next level of depth that makes everything even denser. Ancient texts don't just talk about the future return of the departed authorities. They talk extensively about preparation for that return. And when you start paying attention to the details of that preparation, extremely specific patterns emerge. In the Book of Enoch, there's an entire section called the Book of the Watchers that describes not only the fall of the rebellious angels and their specific transgressions, but primarily what happened to the hybrid offspring they generated. The Nephilim, giants who dominated the earth through superior physical strength, consumed natural resources on an unsustainable scale, waged violent war amongst themselves and against normal humans, and created an era of total violence and irreversible genetic corruption. The flood came specifically to physically eliminate them from the face of the earth. But chapter 15 of Enoch records something absolutely crucial that almost no one mentions. The spirits of the Nephilim were not destroyed along with their physical bodies during the flood. They continued to exist as disembodied entities, disembodied evil spirits, wandering the earth, oppressing humans, causing disease and madness, and will remain active until the day of final judgment when they will be permanently confined. This is not a later theological interpretation. This is written directly in the text of Enoch as an explanation of the origin of the demons that torment humanity. Now look at the Mesopotamian texts with this understanding. After the flood, in Akkadian and Sumerian literature, extensive descriptions of demons, evil spirits, disembodied entities that torment humans, cause illness, bring nightmares, and induce madness emerge. These evil spirits have specific names, organized hierarchies, defined functions, and described methods of operation. And the Mesopotamian exorcism texts, of which we have hundreds preserved, consistently describe these spirits as remnants of a previous era, as survivors of a generation that was physically destroyed but maintained spiritual existence. The textual connection is absolutely direct. The Mesopotamian texts and the Enochian texts are speaking of the same category of entities, of the same pre-flood origin, and of the same problematic post-flood continuity. And both make it clear that the flood eliminated the hybrid physical bodies, but did not solve the underlying spiritual problem, and that this spiritual problem will continue to be active and operative until the final, definitive reset. In the New Testament, there are passages that are rarely consciously connected with this entire ancient narrative, but which make perfect sense when placed in this context. Ephesians chapter 6 verses 10 to 12 explicitly states that the battle of Christians is not against flesh and blood, not against visible human enemies, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. These are not generic, unorganized demons. They are structured hierarchies with positions of command and areas of jurisdiction. 2 Peter chapter 2 verses 4 to 9 and Jude verses 6 and 7 speak of angels who sinned, who did not keep their original position, who were cast into Tartarus, who are reserved under darkness in eternal chains for the judgment of the great day. The term Tartarus that Peter uses is not an original Christian theological concept. It is a Greek term that appears in Hesiod and in Greek mythology, describing a deep prison far below Hades itself, where rebellious titans were imprisoned after being defeated by the Olympian gods. But Jude does something even more revealing. He directly quotes the Book of Enoch. Verses 14 and 15 of Jude literally quote Enoch chapter 1 verse 9, including the prophecy of the Lord's return with thousands of his saints to execute judgment. This means that the New Testament writers knew the Book of Enoch, considered it a valid source of quotation, and implicitly validated the Enochian narrative about watchers, Nephilim, and future judgment. And this validation means that the Enochian narrative was directly connected in their minds to the Mesopotamian narrative about the Anunnaki. Because what Enoch calls the watchers, the Sumerian texts call the Anunnaki. What Enoch calls the Nephilim, the Sumerian texts call demigods, heroes of antiquity or men of renown. What Enoch calls forbidden knowledge, taught by the Watchers, the Sumerian texts call civilizing gifts from the gods. These are different vocabularies for equivalent categories of entities and events. But there is something more that needs to be understood about the Anunnaki specifically. The Mesopotamian texts do not treat the Anunnaki as a uniform and homogeneous group with identical goals. There are deep internal divisions, there are documented power struggles, there are rival factions. Enki versus Enlil is the most documented conflict, appearing in dozens of different texts. Inanna in conflict with other female deities for supremacy. Marduk rising to power through military and political confrontation against previous generations of Anunnaki. This is not merely dramatic mythology created for entertainment. It is a record of real disputes over territorial control, population loyalty, natural resources, and position in the cosmic hierarchy. And these disputes, according to the texts, were never fully resolved during the period of direct presence on Earth. They were suspended, postponed, with the promise of a definitive future resolution. The pattern that emerges from the texts is consistent. Conflict between Anunnaki factions, intervention by a higher authority, temporary reorganization of the hierarchy, promise of future resolution when all factions will finally be judged and permanent order will be established. And this future resolution is always described in terms of return, public judgment, and definitive separation between loyal and rebellious factions. In the biblical apocalypse, there is a description of the final battle of Armageddon between the Lamb with his heavenly armies and the kings of the earth allied with the dragon and the beasts. It is not an abstract spiritual battle taking place in an invisible metaphysical dimension. It is a confrontation of real authorities in visible physical manifestation. And the described result is not total and immediate annihilation of all enemies, but specific imprisonment in the abyss for a period of 1,000 years, followed by a final temporary release for the ultimate confrontation, and only then permanent confinement in the lake of fire. Why this complex pattern? Why not simply immediate and permanent destruction? Because cosmic legal protocol demands that all factions be publicly tested, that all options be completely exhausted, that all claims be answered, and that no entity can claim in the final judgment that it did not have a fair opportunity or that it was not adequately warned. This is not emotional revenge. It is meticulous cosmic jurisprudence. Ancient texts make it absolutely clear that what is approaching is not improvisation, not a divine emotional reaction, and not a random consequence of human chaos. It is execution of protocols established before the foundation of the world, the tablet of destiny in Sumerian tradition, the book sealed with 7 seals in Revelation, the visions of Daniel, the cycles of Jubilees, the Enochian texts, and the Jewish Apocrypha describe the same reality in different languages. Decrees were written, authority was delegated, limits were imposed, transgressions occurred, judgments were pronounced, and returns were scheduled. The Anunnaki, called Watchers in Enoch, Archons in Gnostic texts, and Anush Uthra among the Mandeans, are not disconnected mythological figures. They are equivalent categories of entities that they physically intervened in human history. They taught knowledge, altered the structure of civilization, violated specific rules, and were restricted, imprisoned, or removed, awaiting the appointed time for their return. They did not disappear. They were dismissed. And separation doesn't mean extinction. It means strategic waiting within the schedule. All independent traditions agree on one fundamental point. The world today operates under a temporary, illegitimate government. Authorities who shouldn't be governing occupy positions of power. Powers that haven't received an ontological right to rule, control political, economic, and spiritual systems. And there will be a specific day when administrative correction, it's not just moral judgment. It's not just punishment for individual behavior. It's repossession. Someone is governing without authorization, and this will be corrected by a higher authority. The texts unanimously state that before a full return, there will be objective, measurable, and recognizable signs. Wars on an increasing scale. Collapse of social structures, famines and systemic crises, earthquakes and natural disasters with increasing frequency, signs in the skies, exponential advancement of knowledge, seed mixing, genetic manipulation, return of ancient spiritual practices, centralization of political and economic power, global systems for controlling identity and transactions. These aren't random punishments, they're phase markers, indicators that the current cycle is ending and that the final protocol is being activated. What Daniel describes as the stone that destroys the statue, Revelation describes as the 7th trumpet and the 7th bowl. The Sumerians describe as the great assembly of the gods. It's the same event structurally. Direct intervention from heaven, collapse of illegitimate hierarchies, confrontation between rival authorities, and total reorganization of order. This is not gradual evolution. It's a sudden impact. It's not a reform. It's a replacement. The final battle is not between humanity and beings from another planet in the simplistic sense. It is between factions of cosmic authority. Some entities remained loyal to the original order, others rebelled, some await judgment. Others will openly align themselves against the supreme authority, and humans, consciously or not, will be aligned with one of these sides out of loyalty, ideology, adoration, or rejection. There is no neutrality in this scenario. Apocalyptic texts do not use vague symbolic language. They describe prisons, jails, abysses, trials, captures, cosmic deportations, and government reintegration. The standard is legal, administrative, and military, not poetic. Each phase exists so that no entity, human or otherwise, can claim injustice, lack of opportunity, or ignorance. All options are exhausted before a final verdict is reached. This is not revenge. It is meticulous cosmic jurisprudence. According to an integrated reading of the texts, the Anunnaki do not return as benevolent saviors of humanity, nor do they return as absolute conquerors without opposition. They return as part of a larger process of judgment, alignment, and ultimate separation. Some factions will align themselves with legitimate authority. Others will align themselves with rebellion. The confrontation is not just physical, it is jurisdictional. Who has the right to govern? Who violated the pact? Who remained faithful? The Apocalypse describes Christ returning with heavenly armies. Sumerian texts describe Marduk returning to reorganize order. The Mandaeans describe the great final revelation. The Gnostics describe the descent of the Illuminator to confront the Archons. Theologies are different. The structure is the same. Return of supreme authority, public exposure of illegitimate authorities, trial, removal, and establishment of a new permanent order. And here's the point that destroys the comfortable modern narrative. If these texts are correct, then humanity is not the product of isolated evolution. It is a product of intervention, engineering, knowledge transfer, supervision, strategic abandonment, and planned return. Civilization did not grow on its own, it was conducted, and now it is happening, prepared. The growing global interest in suppressed ancient texts, archaeological discoveries that challenge official chronology, exponential technological advancement, artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, human-machine fusion, space exploration, the centralization of political and financial power, digital identity systems. None of this is random. It's about aligning the scenario. It's about preparing the infrastructure. It's final stage of protocol. The real conflict in history has never been about right or left, religion A or religion B, capitalism or socialism, science or faith. It has always been about legitimate authority. Who governs by right? Who set the rules? Who violated them? Who remained loyal? Who rebelled? And who will be removed? The texts make it clear. The return will happen. The confrontation will take place. The trial will be public. The separation will be final. And the new order will be irreversible. No more flooding. No new cycle. No restart. What was suspended will be resumed. What was usurped will be returned. What has been corrupted will be exposed. And what has always been legitimate will finally be established before everyone. And that's why this content is not entertainment. It's a warning. It's not a historical curiosity. It's preparation. It's not theory. It's a direct reading of patterns that have been repeating for millennia. The official history we were taught is incomplete, and the ending hasn't happened yet.